Welcome to My Big Safety Challenge, a podcast all about stories of safety leadership, presented by Dale Carnegie and the Board of Certified Safety Professionals.
Jason, there are certain people that you encounter in life that it's like they have a life message that they give through their experiences, through how other people poured into them, through what they've sought out to learn. Perry is one of those people.
He is one of those people, and we have the pleasure and the privilege of hearing from Perry today. And I think what's important to understand is that during the pandemic, before and after, he was responsible for more than 90,000 people across more than 300 sites. And in that process was able to reduce incidents, yes, and I think most importantly, serious incidents across a large, complex manufacturing company. And he's going to talk about just how to do that with us today. And he's going to talk about some of his personal principles in leadership, which I think is going to be a treat for our listeners.
And we're talking to somebody here who has a lot of real life safety experience. And with that, I'm sure comes some real life safety challenges. And so please tell us about our guest, then we're going to jump right in with him.
Yeah, I would be happy to. So, Merle, you nailed it. We are honored. We're excited to welcome Dr. Perry Logan today. Perry has been a mentor and a sponsor to me, yes, of course, but to hundreds, if not thousands of people. Well, what's that distinction? Mentors help people get better. Sponsors help people get ahead. And Perry's done that for so many different people, and we're excited to hear about his experience, his journey, his, as you nailed it, struggles and challenges, and then how he's overcome them with some of his principles of leadership. Perry, great to have you joining us today.
Man, I am honored to be here with you gentlemen. I mean, really, really honored. It's this is a nice surprise, Merle. You're a great voice, so this is a lot of fun for me.
Perry, one of the things we usually just get started with is just to say, what in the world attracted you to a life spent influencing people in safety? Kind of what's your origin story? Would you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, I think it probably connects two things, but all of it comes back to where I grew up. Merle, we were talking about me living in Minnesota now. I've been living in St. Paul, Minnesota for over 20 years, but I'm actually from the Florida Keys.
Wow.
I grew up on an island. It was a very rural upbringing, actually. There's not many people on the islands, and especially the island I was on. And so you do what you do on islands, and that is do a lot of stuff out in the water. And it turns out one of my best friend in high school, his parents owned a dive shop. And so I grew up working in a dive shop, and then my next door neighbor was a roofer. And so I ended up doing a lot of outdoor stuff in the sun, but a lot of diving. And my dad, the whole reason we were down in the Keys is because my dad was a commercial diver, underwater welder diver. And Merle, back in the 70s and 80s when he was working, that was the most dangerous job on earth. It was a really, really dangerous job. And so my dad he was a great, great mentor for me because he would always have me at his side doing stuff. And so I remember sitting on a crane operator's lap when I was probably about 7 years old on a barge, learning how to operate a crane because he was doing some diving. But one of the connection to safety and health was my dad went through a dive school, and there were 8 guys in his dive school, and within about 10 years, half of them were dead. And so, my dad had a real acute sense of hazards, and high hazards especially, because he worked in such a demanding and high hazard kind of operation for most of his life, that he really made sure that I knew when we were about to do something that was dangerous. He would say to me, you got to pay attention right now, because what he was about to say was the controls. He was about to talk about controls. And so I didn't realize this actually, but I had been trained into safety and health from a really young age. And so, growing up in the Keys, I had thousands of hours of diving. And that dive shop I worked at, another connected story to that was there was a dive master who was just this wonderful human being who it was the kind of dive master everybody wanted to learn from. And he was diving in Belize, and anybody who knows about Belize, the reefs are very deep if you go to the east side of the reef, it just goes down. You can go into hundreds of feet of depth very quickly. And he got nitrogen narcosis, which basically can make you feel high as a kite. And he unfortunately just kept going down and never came back. And I remember that I was in high school at the time, and Marianne, who was the owner of the dive shop, I remember when she told me that, I was just like, I was crushed, because he was such a great person. And so, I saw this connection between hazards and risk, and it's about people. Yeah, so that was kind of my origin story. And then I went into chemical engineering, and then, I got, multiple graduate degrees and things like that. But it really started before then.
We
Yeah.
find this with a lot of safety professionals, that there was a story in their life or stories like that, early events that took place that really caught their attention, made them say, this well-being of people through this safe environments to work in. But sounds like your childhood stories and your young adult stories really helped to guide your whole life. And that's a great thing. Thank you for telling us about that.
Perry, you referenced one thing. You said your dad, he was a good coach, he was a good mentor and sponsor. He'd say, you've got to pay attention. So tell us why in the 70s and even in the 80s and 90s, that was probably pretty good advice. Tell us why in 2024, that's probably not very good advice if we actually want to drive safety performance in our operations.
Yeah, boy, great catch, Jason. That's a really great catch. If you think about that question, it's almost saying like you are fully responsible for all of your safety, which is true, but it's not necessarily helping us think about the big picture of like, why are we engaging in this high hazard activity? And how can we think differently about the risk and apply a different kind of approach? So my dad has a very much an old school view of safety. And I've had many conversations with him about more of a new view about it. Like, hey, what if we eliminated that hazard? What if then we don't even have to worry about someone paying attention because we've eliminated the hazard. And he's come around to really appreciate that new view of really thinking about how do we think differently about how we do things, and not think it's only on that employee or that person to think about the control that they have to be perfect in order to do it, but think about how can we build systems and controls that just really eliminate or fully isolate that hazard from the employee. So it's a really great question, Jason.
So I'm just curious, Perry, because is it possible for safety professionals, for the people listening to this podcast, to get a bit lulled into comfort and fail to step back and ask those questions? How have you seen that, just even in today's time? How do we be careful that we just don't get a little numb to just how things are and we dig a little deeper?
Oh man, Merle, that just gets into how we're wired as humans. I think the majority of our life, we're operating on automatic, right? And we know that. I mean, all the neuroscience tells us that the vast, vast majority of all of our decisions are unconscious decisions. We just do it without even thinking. And so it takes really good questions to actually get us to shift our thinking. And I was actually just talking to a group this morning It was a bunch of really great companies. And we were talking about that shift, Merle. Like, how do we ask a question that gets us to think differently? Because if we don't do that, we're just going to be on automatic. And I think it's a tendency we have to all fight, and no one is immune from it. You know, I start off by saying, let me tell you, I am constantly fighting it as a human being. And I'm lucky to have friends. My wife is great at doing it. Jason will do anybody. I want to surround myself with people who will challenge me and ask me questions that gets me to think like, wait a minute, why am I doing it this way? Why are we doing it this way? Is there a better way to do this? So I think you're right on, Merle. It's kind of wired in, and it takes oftentimes someone to help us see something that we can't see.
Now, Perry, you probably realize that I work with the Dale Carnegie organization. I know you have a bit of background with that we'll get into later. But one of the things we work to do on this podcast is to weave in some of those human relation principles of Dale Carnegie and how folks like you are putting them into practice to encourage other people to look for ways. There are two of those principles that you were describing there. One principle is ask questions instead of giving direct orders. And in a sense, that can have many applications. But that's one of them you just said there. Rather than say, just do this, let's ask the question. The other one that you were putting into practice is one that says, talk about your own mistakes before criticizing the other person. And when you said, I have to realize, hey, I have to watch this, that's a level of humility. What do you suppose there is, Perry, about that makes people, that helps a leader when they're willing to talk about their own mistakes first?
Yeah, it's funny how it almost automatically diffuses things for people. I think it comes from the fact that people feel comfortable that I'm not going to judge them, that I'm not going to say, well, gosh, you're making a mistake, because I'm acknowledging right out of the gate, hey, I'm not perfect. And, I appreciate that you're not judging me. And I'll just tell you about the mistake that I made. And so it makes it safe. I think it really creates a safe space for people to just be honest. I mean, let's face it, we could change the world at the snap of a finger if we could snap our fingers and just create integrity in everything we did. And I think that's a really good way to show integrity, is by just being honest and transparent about the mistakes we make. And that's why I think it builds that connection. People don't feel like they're going to get judged, Merle.
And I'll just add this. When you use that word integrity, some people say, well, I tell the truth. It is not just telling the truth. It's, as a safety professional, living the truth and letting our actions show the truth that lets people then say, that man, that woman has integrity, leans toward them trusting us and looking to us even more. So you're hitting on a good cylinder there, sir.
Perry, to build on the judgment piece, something that reminds me of, Marcus Aurelius said this 2,000 years ago. He said, be strict with yourself, tolerant with others. And if there's something that I see you do day in and day out, and you've done it for the last decade or so, it's be really strict with your personal standards. And then not to judge others, but to be accepting of others, but them also to raise their standard and to help them raise their standard in an acceptable, responsible way and respectful way, not a judgmental way. You also talked about HHAs, high hazard activities. Why don't you tell us a little bit about one of your first safety meetings at a specific chemical plant in a specific state, specific city in the area of Alabama? Tell us a little bit about your high hazard activity experience and what you learned from that.
I had started off in chemical engineering school, and I didn't come from a family of a lot of means, and so I had to work my way through school. And I worked in hazardous waste operations in school, and so I learned a lot about protecting yourself in hazardous conditions. And so I get a job in Alabama at a very large facility, very complex chemical operation. It handled chlorine gas in the rail car level of multiple rail cars level of chlorine handling. And I was walking to my first safety committee meeting at this plant. And I noticed a kind of a cloud coming out of a manhole. And at the same time, I'm like, whoa. I mean, I had tears in my eyes right away of like, man, this is chlorine bad. And so I went into the room to the building, was on the left-hand side, and we'll go into the safety committee meeting. And I'm like, and some people are like, hello. And I'm like, stunned. And I'm like, did you all just see that cloud of chlorine gas? And I just remember them looking at me and saying like, oh yeah, did you all see that? You know, they were just like, for them, it did not seem like any kind of high hazard experience. And I'm like, guys, that is what is called immediately dangerous to life and health. And they're like, yeah, I think we ought to call, and I forgot who it was, the guy's name. I think he needs to adjust the valve. Just like, that was such an eye-opening experience to me to understand their level of risk perception and my level of risk perception. But I would have been in level A walking through there. And so it was a shocker for me to do that. And it was great because I could use that story for, forever, for the rest of my career there, to talk about like, hey, there are some high hazard activities that if you're not aware of, somebody could take a deep breath of that chlorine right there and actually have a serious condition in their lungs result from it. And there's two parts of it, Jason. There's one part of recognizing the high hazards that are there and recognizing what the controls are, but it's also helping people recognize when there's really a high hazard that they may not see that as a high hazard activity because you did that job. And, I mentioned to Merle about, in the Keys, working roofing. Well, the roofing work I did, we did not wear fall protection. And we were at the leading edge. And today, I look back, it makes my hands sweat now thinking about how close I could have come to dying, being on roofs as many times as I was without proper fall protection. And so I don't ever want people to feel judged because, hey, I've done it myself and I get it. So I want to feel empathy for people who may be in that kind of situation, Jason, where they're working in a high hazard activity and they may not realize it. And I've made mistakes here, holy cow, where I have come upon, in fact, in that same plant, I could go on in stories in that plant. I walked up on a maintenance guy who was in a trench, who had his arm up in a pipe. And his name's Jerry. I was like, Jerry, what in the bleep are you doing? And he was, he was irritated. And I think he was irritated before I said that to him. But, that tone was not the right tone for him. I was scared for him. And he got up out of that trench and, I was like, what are you doing? You are not following the procedure. I don't even know what the procedure is, but I can guarantee it does not include what you're doing. And I remember he had his tools in his hand and he took his tools and he dropped them out in front of me, said, why don't you do it, big boy?
Ooh.
I was like, Jerry, I am so sorry. I had to apologize very quickly because, the reality is Jerry was so much more competent than I will ever be in my life on how to maintain really complex equipment. And so, there's an example there of Jason where I came upon somebody in a high hazard activity, and my response was not the right response. And I've thought about it probably 100 times how I would do that differently if I came upon Jerry again.
Well, here we have a couple more principles. One you excelled in, one that there's a little bit of opportunity for growth. How's that for a nice way? Or we call them OFIs, opportunities for improvement. So we have the principle, begin in a friendly way. So it's like you don't blast the person out of the saddle, and you realize that. But your other one, if you're wrong, admit it quickly and emphatically. And respect levels go up. For safety professionals, human beings, we respect when somebody says, I goofed, and I take the blame for it.
You got your finger right on a key thing, Merle. If I would have been all arrogant in my safety, I got this degree and that and blah, blah, blah. Whoa, boy, that would have not worked well. So I learned real quick that it goes a long way. That principle goes a really long way.
Perry, I want to circle back to the HHA, the high hazard activity conversation, because what I heard in your story is that the standard that was set at the site was an acceptable standard for some, in this case actually most, but it probably wasn't the right standard. And you and I have a COO that we have a high level of respect for, someone who has consistently driven business and safety performance at multiple companies. And he believes that leadership, standards, and engagement are the three things that you absolutely have to deliver on. Tell us your perspective on that, and then tell us really specifically about the standards piece, because it seems that's where most companies are dropping the ball right now. But tell us about all three and what they mean to you.
Yeah, that's beautiful, Jason. So that leadership, there's multiple parts about that, but one of the things that he does is he really will walk the floor and engage people in a really respectful way. And what he'll do in that engagement is to set the standard, to say like, hey, if we were to improve this job, what would you want? How would you make this a safer job? And then they get into a dialogue about it, and then he can set, this is where we need to be. And so he can set that standard in a very clear way, which for an operational leader, I will say is very unique for him to have that level of understanding of hazards. His level of understanding is really, really high. And so as a result, he can communicate very clearly about what the standard is. And, actually this morning, talking to a bunch of really great folks at companies, we were actually talking about clarity of standard. And that oftentimes one of the mistakes we make as, technical safety professionals is we have the 120-page standard document with every detail that you would ever need to have, but it doesn't actually help people know what they need to do because it's so complicated and it's so nuanced. And really what we need to do is make the standard very clear. And so that's what we were talking about this morning, actually, was like, it's so hard to state the standard very clearly in a way that literally everyone can understand. Mm-hmm. Everyone can understand. So the leadership part connects to how you engage employees and how you communicate the standard. I'll just say, Jason, I think that we need to do a much better job coaching. As safety professionals, we've got to coach leaders, and we have to, the truth is safety and health professionals are good at it when they know kind of the principles of how you coach in a respectful way and do those things. And it actually elevates the whole entire profession, in my opinion. I think oftentimes we focus on the technical things, which are super important, of course, but we lose sight of some of these leadership principles that actually make the biggest difference. And by coaching leaders on how to engage people, engage employees who are doing the job, doing the most important work, to be really clear on what the standards are and what the expectation is, and then really be listening to the employees to hear, well, here's a problem with doing what you're asking. Here's the challenge I have, right? And that COO does that so well. He'll ask that question essentially, and when the employee says, well, it'd be great, I'd love to do that, but the problem is this thing is in the way.
I think what I'm hearing here, Perry, is, if we look at, you reference clarity of standards multiple different times. And I think it was Jason Laird who said this. He says, the clearer the vision, the fewer the options, the easier the decisions. But it's not a clear standard/vision when you have a 120-page document that basically says no cell phone use while driving. That's what I'm hearing. If the standard is no cell phone use while driving, then just write no cell phone use while driving. That's what I'm hearing. What am I missing here? Because it seems simple, but it also seems like one of the hardest things that we're having to overcome as a profession. If you're talking about this, and I know you're on an advisory council with dozens of companies that are senior leaders, why are we still talking about clarity of standards? Because it seems simple.
Yeah, I think the biggest problem, Jason, is we mix audiences. And so, you can take something technical like machine guarding and think about all the intricacies of really building the right controls in machine guard. You need to have that detail there in order for those controls, that light curtain to work and all of those things to work. So you have to have that level of detail from the engineering side to make it work. But when we're communicating to everyone who's interacting with that, we don't want to be in that same mode of all of those details. We need to be very, very clear on when you trigger the light curtain and everything shuts down. Here's how the simple startup works, right? Not read the 12-page document. It needs to be a very crisp, clear communication. And I think what happens is we get caught up in both. We know the technical stuff matters because it does. Machine guarding is a perfect example of that. But on the communication side, we need to communicate in a very clear sense. And honestly, I learned about communication too late in life. And appreciated some of those important, very simple things that I think someone who has a background in communications is like very obvious. But I don't think that we learn that as safety and health professionals in our training. And I think that's a disservice. So I think there's opportunities for all of us to get much better on how we communicate clearly to exactly your point, so that we can be very simple, to the point, in a way that it resonates with everyone, not trying to take the engineering detail and then try and just spit it out to everyone, because you only have 7 seconds. That's it.
Say more about that. You only have 7 seconds. And then you referenced also about coaching and how our role has, I wouldn't even say expanded, I would say has emphasized the coaching as much as ever. Tell us about a specific time you've had to coach either a senior leader and or maybe someone on the shop floor. But first, tell us about that 7 seconds piece. That's intriguing.
So I think in the last 10 years in my professional roles, I was constantly telling safety and health professionals, I'd ask them to summarize whatever they're doing. And then I would usually come back and say, look, you have to say that in 7 seconds. Because when you're talking to an executive leader, they have so many things that they're processing. You oftentimes only have 7 seconds to make your point. And what it does is it forces us to get really clear about what's most important and how to communicate with real precision. And it turns out it's actually less than 7 seconds. When you actually look at the science is it's actually less than 7 seconds. I wish I would have read the science before saying that for 10 years, but it's still the kind of the principle is there. You have to do it in a very short amount of time. And that's just a human nature thing. And when you're able to do that, Jason, you know this really well, when you're able to communicate in such a way to executives like that, what happens is they want to listen to you. They actually want to hear what you have to say, because they know you're not going to take up a bunch of space, and you're going to say something when it's needed and it's going to be important, and it's going to get to the point. Now, for some people, we all have different personality styles. For some personality styles, it's easy to communicate that way because we're actually wired that way. And then some personality styles are not wired that way. But the good news is everyone can learn to do it. It's not rocket science. It's just by practice, really practicing how to do that. So I think that's a key thing. On your second part of the question, I could go on forever about these stories of when a leader is really needed coaching. And so, for instance, we would review all of the most serious incidents that occurred globally on a weekly basis. And these are, president of operations, executive vice presidents, senior vice presidents in the meeting. And we're reviewing it with the purpose of finding what system failed. But as you know, we're human, and oftentimes we're going to want to find blame, right? And when we get into that framework of looking for blame, we're actually not solving the problem. We're actually pushing the problem aside and solving the wrong problem. And so I've had that happen multiple times where I actually created a slide that, Jason, you've seen it, on the left-hand side, it has blame and punish. And on the right-hand side, it says learn, coach, and improve. And when it didn't happen often, but when it did happen where the conversation really took a wacky turn, I would actually just take control of the meeting because it's in Teams, and I would just throw up the slide and I wouldn't say anything.
Let the slide speak.
It'll let the slide speak and let it kind of marinate. And then it was hard. The hardest part was like trying to like get everybody back and say like, yeah, I know you guys are frustrated. I can totally get that. But really what we've got to think about is what system failed here, right? I don't want to talk about punishing the person because that's not fixing it for the other people who do that job. And so there was always an important thing that we needed to coach in that situation so that then I could come back around and talk to them later and, have a conversation. So it's like, Yvonne, hey, let's talk about that situation there. What do you think about it? Like, what would you do differently? And we could kind of work through it and maybe hopefully laugh about it.
Perry, if I were to listen to this podcast episode, maybe even 3 years ago, who knows, maybe even last year, I'd hear that and I'd say, I'm going to do that at our next SIF review meeting. I'm going to create the slide. Perry, he's a VP, global safety and health, big company. That's what I'm going to do. Not understanding context and not understanding egos. And if you're a big hitter in the big company, I promise you got a big ego. It's not a bad thing. We all have egos, but we just have to be very delicate with how we approach those. Tell us about, at the same time, managing that and understanding personality styles before you throw a slide like that up.
Yeah, absolutely. I would only put that up there with, these are top executives, but I knew all of them. And I had a relationship with them. And so because of having a relationship there, I was able to do that. And the second thing is we had already coached about it, right? So with every one of them, we had talked about how we really activate our culture and how we bring in human and organizational principles and how we do things, which, laid the foundation for me to put that slide up. And I'm really glad you pointed that out, Jason, because I would not recommend just creating a slide and doing that. You have to do all that groundwork. And it really comes from, having good relationship with folks and listening. Listening becomes it is probably the secret to success. I mean, it's one of the most important things we can do. I mean, it goes to your relationship with your kids, your wife, it doesn't matter. But especially at work is really listening for what is being said. Maybe, and it may not be exactly the words, it's what is being said. And so having the ability to listen there first, before you jump is super important. But you do have to have the courage to say what needs to be said. And it may not be popular sometimes.
Perry, we as safety professionals, though, we've done all this study. We've read the OSHA. We've got all these guidelines. I mean, I just want to erp it all out to everybody and let them have it, because I got it oozing out of me. And now you're telling me that I need to listen? Really?
Yes. Yes. Yes.
That's why the principle is be a good listener. Encourage other people. Talk about themselves, their ideas, their perspectives, and hear them. Even what you said about the coaching of folks, the principle that says use encouragement. Make the fault seem easy to correct, where you use your example of Yvonne and say, hey, let's just talk this over here and all. Would you talk to us a bit, though, about, for the folks that are listening, the fear of failure as a professional, and how we need to look at a failure or a mistake that we make, because most of us want to do it so right, and we feel like our reputation's on the line. I mean, we're doing critical things. Is there room for a mistake on our part?
Yeah. Oh my gosh, Merle, honestly, I think all of us will do good to help our organizations shift their thinking about that. And we can do that by demonstrating good behavior around that. But having a continuous improvement mindset of we're going to make mistakes and we're going to learn from those mistakes. And we want to make sure that when we make a mistake, nothing bad happens. Yes. And I think that resonates with every part of the company or organization that you're in. Everyone understands that at a real basic level. And so if we can get this, and maybe the terms, kind of continuous improvement mindset, I think that's one that resonates with a lot of people, to think like, hey, mistakes will be made and we're going to learn from them. And we're going to make sure that we've set up our systems in such a way that nobody gets hurt when something fails in our system. It is a really hard thing. It gets back to ego a bit, like we want to be right, as humans, we want to be right. We want to be in control. We want to look good. Those are just like human nature. And so we have to have a high level of awareness, so that we don't get caught by that. So to do what you're saying there, Merle, I think we have to start with a really high level of awareness. And once we have that, then our egos won't get in the way so much. And so the example of we could take work at height as an example. I mean, everybody loves talking about work at height because it's something that we know we have passion about. Like, we can save lives when we do that right. And if you can talk to an executive about what do you think are the most powerful controls for this specific situation, and just, you have a dialogue with them, you have a conversation with them, and then you can show them where they're like, yeah, you've got some great insight in this. This is great. And let me tell you, let me tell you a little bit about the anchoring points there and how important that is, because you touched on that, Yvonne, and I just want to really acknowledge that is maybe even more important than you realize. And what you do in that conversation now is you build wonderful credibility, you build a great relationship, and you can build a better understanding.
And I think it's important for the listeners to notice the way you gave that example of Yvonne, that you said, let that person say some things, and you said, yes, and then you built upon it in that way. And that is a wonderful way not to say, it's like what we learned in improv. It's not yes, but it's yes, and you guide through that.
Perry, you said listening is the secret to success. And then I'll just paraphrase. You're not just listening for the words, you're listening for the signals. And there's some signals that we need to make sure that we're listening to and seeing in safety and health over the past several decades. One of those signals is this idea that incident rate has consistently been reduced, yet fatalities, and specifically, I believe, serious injuries and fatalities, has not moved in approximately, let's just say, 30 years. So less paper cuts and bee stings, just the same amount of fatalities, amputations, so on and so forth. Why is that a loud signal that we need to make sure that we're listening to? And how do we get off this plateau? I think Todd Conklin calls it the big stall? How do we get off this big stall that we're on?
It's actually worse than what you said. Fatalities count and rate is up. So if you look, and you can go to National Safety Council has a wonderful website, Injury Facts. I'd recommend everybody go to you can just Google Injury Facts NSC, and you can see that in 2022 we were higher than over the past 10 years. Significantly, it has jumped up, and you know. As a safety and health professional, I'm just like appalled that we have not been focused on these serious incidents and fatalities and really going after it. And so I think there's a rally cry that's needed amongst all professionals for us to go out. And then some people might say, well, that's not my industry. I don't know. They're still human beings, and I think we can do so much better, because the truth is that there are companies that are doing very well in this space, and they are doing some just amazing things that I think everyone can learn from, and we could really turn this down. We can really turn this down, but we are not in a good place, my friend. Not at all.
And Perry, you're right. There has to be a level of dissatisfaction where we take a look in the mirror, because the first step in any change is you get dissatisfied with where you're at versus where you want to get to. It's the first step in change always. And you and I first got dissatisfied when we started attending this group called ORCHSE. And for those that don't know the group, this is basically, it's like the Illuminati, right? Like they actually run the safety profession, but they're the best kept secret in safety. They're like the secret society. Everyone needs to be a part of it, but it's the best kept secret. How do we make sure that we get more people exposed to, I'll just call them networking and benchmarking organizations? Because you said it, there's some companies that have cracked the code on how to prevent serious injuries and fatalities. But if we're stuck inside our own companies, you can't read the label from inside of the bottle, and we get stuck in our own ways of doing things. How do we expand people's belief systems and get them linked up with these types of networks and organizations?
First, I just want to say it comes down to purpose. And when you're engaging with folks, if you're in a conference, an ASSP conference, an AIJ conference, a CCPS, whatever conference you're in, you should be looking for those people that are changing the way things are being done. And so you should seek them out, because there are networks that are exactly doing those things that anyone can plug into, that I find that I'm always surprised that a lot of people don't know about it, but I didn't know about it either. We were members of in when I was at 3M at part of that group, and to be honest, I learned more from those groups than I learned in all of my schooling. I mean, about actually making really substantial changes, because they had the how, the why, and the how very clear. And you don't necessarily get that in school. And the how is how it works and what doesn't work and why didn't that work. And so I think you really are pointing out a great thing, Jason. The truth is in safety, there's no IP as far as intellectual property. We're in this to save people. It is really about making a difference for people. And when you hang around, my grandfather, you've heard this quote, Jason. My grandfather used to say, hang out with people smarter than you and better looking. And what he was saying two things, really, really wonderful man. He was saying, basically, if you hang out with people who are doing really good stuff, you're going to start doing really good stuff.
I doubt there's anybody on this that will listen to this podcast that'll say, I don't think that's the right thing. What keeps us back?
I think two things. One is complacency. We get into our routine, and it's effort actually to reach out, to do. It is an extra bit of effort, to join a network like Jason's talking about. It is actually work, because you got to bring it. because you're with some top dogs. So you got to bring it. You got to bring value. And then the other part was, I think we've touched on it before. It's like our ego. We're worried about like sharing something like, gosh, our powered industrial vehicle program is really bad. I'm sorry to share with you guys, but I got to tell you, it's not great. And here's the problems I'm having. And then you look over at a Lori or a Marty, and it's like, gosh, you know what? I had that same problem, and this is what we did.
There are other people then at that point that will say, I don't really know this as well either. So we get to start the chain reaction to things. And we can start a trend in a very humble way. Very humble way.
One area where we realized that we were smart enough to know that we weren't smart enough, and we had to seek counsel, which is what you keep referencing, is we need to seek counsel to recognize that we don't have the answer and seek counsel elsewhere. A place that we realized that when you and I worked for a large manufacturing company was around our serious injuries and fatalities, our SIFs. And then we sought counsel, we came back, we executed, we implemented, and we saw a significant reduction in our SIFs. One of those things we did was through what's called a RAP workshop. Tell us about a RAP workshop so we can give some of the listeners out there a very tangible and tactical tool about how they can make sure they understand their high hazards and then actually do something about them.
Beautiful question. So number one, you have to think about your high hazard activities and actually create an inventory of what they are so that you have the entire scope. So we started off with building high hazard inventories, and that was a really great exercise. It's a painful exercise for a lot of people to try and coach them to explain why it's important to do that. But once everybody created those high hazard activities, we could systematically go through and do a RAP workshop, which is a learning team, to bring the right people together to figure out, what are my controls? What are all the controls that we have in place? And where do we need to strengthen our controls for that high hazard activity? And it's like, if you do that systematically, it actually can encompass all of the things that, Merle, you've been asking about on leadership. You bring those in a learning, continuous improvement kind of view. And that RAP workshop was instrumental, absolutely instrumental, because it's a learning team. It's a diverse group of people with a lot of different skill sets and views to come in to solve challenges, but more importantly, kind of strengthen our controls. Is super, super powerful. And, too often we get into a very technical risk assessment, because we're the experts, Merle, and that doesn't work. You have to do it with a group of people who are going to bring the maintenance guy or gal in there. You bring some of the production folks in there. You bring the engineer in there. You bring a supervisor in there. You might bring somebody who has a totally different view on anything in there. And now you're thinking about all of the controls and how those controls fail and how you can strengthen and verify those controls. And wow, boy, it's actually fun. I mean, honestly, I love doing RAP workshops. I mean, that's one of the things I miss. There's a handful of things I really miss. And that's one of them, Jason, was that, that learning, because it's a continuous learning kind of thing. And it was improving. You walked out of there knowing you just made something safer, and you had everyone on the team. It wasn't a safety person telling you how to do it. It was, we all came together and we had good dialogue and debate and everything like that. But you came with an end result that was awesome. And as a result, we could see the residual risk come down. We could see it in the data because we built the fundamentals of a risk, that RAP, into our systems and into our audit systems, everything. And you could see residual risk come down very, very quickly. And it gave us a language that, everybody could speak the same language about risk and about controls and things like that.
The principle that says, try honestly to see things from the other person's point of view. And when you mentioned, you bring in the maintenance person, you bring in the engineer, you bring in the person out on the front line. I think too often, years ago, there was that song that said, Billy, don't be a hero. Don't be the fool with your life. Well, we as a safety person, don't try to be the hero. Yeah. Hear from the viewpoints, the perspectives, because they see things they're vital.
Perry, I simply want to summarize what you just said with the RAP workshop. So first step, create a high hazard inventory. Ask the workers what could seriously hurt or kill you. Great
Right.
question. Document that. Bring a diverse group together. Do it in a conference room to begin with. Have a learning team, facilitate a learning team. Assess the risk for one of those tasks at a time. One of those potential SIFs, we could call them. And then what we do is you execute. And how do you execute? Dr. Tom Krause said this. You've heard this, Perry. The only way to make the workplace safer is to actually make the workplace safer. How do you
That's
do
right.
that? Safeguard, save lives. So you execute and you implement controls, which gets us to an acceptable risk.
Yes.
And what we've done is we've integrated leadership, standards, and engagement into the
Yes.
RAP workshop and reiterated all three of those throughout the process.
That last step of using Tom's quote, you do that on the shop floor. You do that where the work gets done. You will do some of that stuff in a conference room for sure, but the way we would always do a RAP workshop is you started at where the job happened, and you may go off in a conference room because you can't talk or you can't see things out in there, but then you come back to see, like, will this, to your point, make the job safer? And just want to tie that down, that RAP workshop, that learning team needs to have some portion of the time actually where it happens.
A couple more questions here, and then we'll bring things to a close. Tell us why you believe that safety and health professionals are innately geared to be some of the most effective leaders of anybody in any profession. Tell us your perspective on that.
It comes back to what I said earlier, Jason. It's why we're in it. We're in it for the people. We're in it for the right reasons to really make a difference. And that is what I think allows us to talk to people in the most important way, because I have never met a safety and health person who didn't care deeply about what they do. And as a result, I think we have an intuition as safety and health professionals on how that caring actually turns into physical, you can see it happen kind of thing, that we have that experience that really puts safety and health professionals in a perfect place. And that's why, I've seen a lot of safety and health professionals get promoted up and out, and, because other parts of the organization realize, oh my gosh, Jason's amazing. Let's have him in, pick your function. Other functions want to have you part of their organization because you bring that, that there's that caring piece that's just innate for a safety and health professional. There's a whole lot of other skill sets too that are very applicable actually outside of safety and health. There's a technical level that safety and health folks have that is really useful, regardless of what part of a function you're in. That's also very useful. There's an experience set that we get as safety and health professionals that is not just, in one corner. It's really diverse and broad. And as a result, I think it gives us a really great perspective. So I think there's a number of things that are very powerful, but I would give you actually those three, Jason.
The other piece I want to hear from you, Perry, you, as well as anybody I've ever met, you've built and then you've led, facilitated high-performance teams. And as we close today, just tell us briefly about what you look for and how you build a high-performing team. We would be, I think, robbing something from our listeners if we didn't get your perspective on high-performing teams.
High-performing teams are, for me, really need to have a diversity of people on the team. You don't build the best NFL team by taking the best quarterbacks of all time and putting them on a team. They'd lose to the last place team in the NFL. You need to have the diversity on that team, and so that's number one, a diversity of skill set. A diversity of personality style is also, I think, very, very important. It can be extremely powerful when you're in a high performance team that's probably going to run pretty fast. So you need to have both of those really dialed in. So those are the start, the diversity. The second thing is we've got to be just really clear about what our goals and objectives are with a high performance team. You got a lot of high energy and really, bright folks and accomplished folks. You need to get everybody together on, all right, what's our purpose and what are we shooting? What's our target? And when you can get that clarity right in the beginning and then refine it over time, because sometimes, your target will change, but having that clear is really important, really, really important. The third thing is, as a leader, you got to get out of the way. You've got to support people and trust people, allow them to fail, support them, and really figure out what they need. Leading a high performance team is hard, but it's so much fun because they're a bunch of rock stars. And when you got a bunch of rock stars, you just are basically asking them, what do you need? What can I do to help you be more successful? So you have to have a different mindset. I've had so many teams where literally everyone on the team is way smarter than me. So I'm not going to tell them anything. They already know. So the only thing I'm doing is asking them questions. What I find is you need to be able to ask questions, the right kind of questions, respectful, but get to the point. But I think that's another really important part of it right there. So I think if you build your mental framework focused on team outcome, getting everybody clear on that, on what the goals are, having a really diverse team, and bringing in the people who need to be in there, you will grow as a professional more than you've ever grown.
I just want to go back. You talked about why safety and health professionals are geared to be some of the most impactful leaders. You and I have heard this before, and I know you deploy it, you leverage it, you think about it all the time. This idea that when Michelangelo was given a block of marble and asked how he sculpted the statue of David, he said, all I did was I chipped away at anything that wasn't David. And so, although we are geared to be so impactful and to drive true change in our organizations, what's the one thing, Perry, that we need to chip away at, that if we don't, it could potentially hold us back from protecting lives like the way we truly can protect and improve lives? What's the one thing?
I'll say the one thing, across the profession is the fear of change. I think we often get hung on to how we've been doing things, and that has been our biggest detriment. And it goes back to one of your earlier questions in the beginning about what's going on with serious fatalities or serious incidents and fatalities. It's like we need to change, and that's the number one thing. And change is it's not as bad as you think it is. It's not as bad as you think it is, but we have to change. That would be my one thing. If we can do that, I really think the leadership principles are the way we do that. If you just think about some of the questions that Merle was asking about leadership, if we can really onboard all of those immediately right now, change will happen very quickly, in fact. But we've got to do that. We've got to be humble to do it, and ask those questions of ourselves, and have the people around us that'll challenge us in that way.
So Perry, in just a moment, we're going to ask you to give a final word of encouragement, challenge, just to the podcast family that's listening. But we've been very fortunate today to be able to learn from your younger experiences that have guided you. All these people have poured into your life throughout your work life and family life and have helped make you the person you are. If you were sitting across from a safety professional, what would you say to them as just a challenge and encouragement?
Yeah, I would go back to my grandfather's quote. I challenge everyone to reach out and connect with someone that they've never really connected with, who they can really learn from. We've got just some amazing people in our profession, and even outside in kind of adjacent professions that could be a one of the most important things you ever did. I could just think of so many times in my life where I had made a connection with someone that literally changed my life. And that is what I would do. I would say, get out of your comfort zone periodically and meet someone, and they may not look the way you think. They may not speak the way you think. And that's a good thing.
Perry, man of experience. One of the things that really stands out to me was he said, seek out people to learn from and help. Don't be stuck in the corner. Humble yourself. Speak up and say, I want to get around you. I'd like to learn. I'd like to listen. Share your ideas. Solid thought.
Solid thought is right. So many different takeaways from Perry, Merle, and some from you as well. I'll just reference one from Perry. You have 7 seconds to make a point. It's this idea that we've moved from the information age into the age of attention. And we have about 7 seconds of someone's attention to deliver the information we need for them to understand. I don't want anybody, especially us, our listeners, hearing that from Perry and being sure to implement that moving forward. 7 seconds to make a point.
Spot on. Thanks, folks, for listening to this podcast, and let's put it to good use and help our people.
Thanks for listening to My Big Safety Challenge, a podcast produced in partnership by Dale Carnegie and BCSP, with your hosts, Dale Carnegie Master Trainer Merle Heckman and Jason Coons, Global EHS Team and Culture Activation Lead for 3M. Executive produced by Charlie Eltringham. Supervising producer and editing by Michael Escobedo. Directed by Michael Escobedo, Joel Burgai, and Giachi Liu. Graphics by Giachi Liu. Editorial support from Brendan Mohawk. Consulting producers are Colin Brown and Mark Sullivan. To have new episodes delivered directly to you, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever fine podcasts are downloaded. If you would like to share your story of a safety leadership challenge you faced, email us at info@mybigsafetychallenge.com. See you next time.